The Maelstrom's Edge video rulebook is a series designed to be viewed in order. Watching these videos out of order may result in some confusion. Welcome back everybody. In this video, we'll continue to examine movement and terrain, this time focusing on the basics of terrain. Unlike in some wargames where it doesn't really matter much whether your guys are in cover or not, in Maelstrom's Edge you'll really want to keep your units in cover whenever you can. Sure, there are times you might decide it's worth it to leave a unit out in the open, but just know they're tremendously vulnerable like that. But before we get to know how your units can take cover, we first need to talk about terrain. There are two main types of terrain, obstacles and area terrain. An obstacle is a solid object like a crate, barrel or a hill. The way a model takes cover with an obstacle is to move so that its base is touching the side of that obstacle, like with this trooper here touching these barrels. As long as the obstacle is between the trooper and the contractor over here, then it will benefit from cover. Buildings are also considered obstacles, which means models generally cannot enter into them. Of course, there are more advanced rules allowing models to enter into buildings, but we'll cover those in a later video. The second type of terrain is area terrain. This is when you have several terrain features mounted together on a single base, like with forests, ruins, or even craters. When it comes to a model taking cover in area terrain, all they need to do is have any portion of their base within it. So whether the trooper is here on the edge or totally inside, in both cases he counts as being in cover within the ruin. Area terrain is a little more abstract than what you have with obstacles, because it's just a representation of far denser terrain than what we can possibly have on our table. Therefore, models are able to move right through area terrain features, no matter how tall they might be. For example, if the trooper wanted to move through the ruin wall here, he wouldn't suffer any negative penalties for doing so. Of course, if he wanted to move onto the upper level here, he would have to count the vertical distance in that case, because it's at least 2 inches from the ground. There are additional terrain effects that you and your opponent can choose to assign to each terrain feature when you feel they're appropriate. Impassable ground is the most simple. It's just an area you think models shouldn't be able to move through at all. Stuff like a bottomless pit, or even a super tall hill like this. If you don't think a model should be able to climb it, then just make it impassable. If you don't feel like making a piece of terrain completely impassable, another option is to make it dangerous ground instead. Dangerous ground is an area that a unit is still able to move through, but they take minor damage when they do so. So let's say you've decided that this barbed wire is dangerous ground. That means any time a unit moves through it, they gain D3 suppression tokens. We'll be going into more detail on suppression in later videos, but for now just know that you definitely don't want your units to have any. And for those of you that have never heard of a D3 before, it just means you roll a single die and halve the result. So if you rolled a 1 or a 2, that would mean a 1. A roll of 3 or 4 would mean a 2, and a roll of 5 or 6 would mean a 3. So if these troopers move through your dangerous ground barbed wire, they'd get 2 suppression, like so. If you want your dangerous ground to have just a little more kick, then you can instead make it into lethal ground. When a unit moves through lethal ground, it's resolved exactly like dangerous ground, except the unit gets 2 D3 suppression instead of just D3. So if you chose to make this barbed wire into lethal ground, then when these troopers move through it, they'd get 5 suppression, like so. It makes such a big difference whether or not your unit is in cover that when you finish a move anywhere near terrain, you must announce to your opponent whether that unit will be taking cover. If you decide to keep your unit out of cover, then naturally none of the models can be placed in or behind terrain. So with this trooper unit, if you wanted them to take cover, you'd have to tell your opponent they're taking cover, and then you'd be free to move them into the terrain as you see fit. You need to put at least half the models in or behind terrain for the whole unit to count as being in cover. So even if you just had these 2 troopers in the forest, then the whole unit is now in cover. On the flip side, if you don't want the unit to take cover, you'll have to tell your opponent they're not taking cover, but then you wouldn't be allowed to move any of the models into the forest at all. Thanks for watching, and make sure to check out our next video where we'll continue to look at movement and terrain, this time focusing on units that are out of cover.